Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leake, the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute, and as always, I'm talking to our chief economist, Greg Jericho. Hello, Greg.
Hi, Elinor.
How are we going today?
Good. I'm just glad you didn't call me Gregory.
No, I'll save that for when you're least expecting it again. So, Greg, in the news this week, 15 Australian universities will have the number of their international students they can take decreased.
The billion-dollar industry at the centre of a political migration debate.
Australia's biggest and best-known universities won't be able to accept so many foreign students under a shake-up of the sector.
International students have become cash cows for the higher education sector and a perceived burden on housing and city infrastructure.
Countries we compete against for talent around the world are not capping their student numbers, and yet Australia is sending a message that you're not welcome here.
It's not that Australian universities have an international student problem. Australian universities have a funding problem.
ANU here in Canberra had its allocation reduced by 14%. A few unis had their number increased, but only by a relatively small amount. International students at Australian universities have been a pretty contentious issue for several reasons. But why have the caps on their number been slashed recently?
Yeah, it's quite a complex issue and a bit of a tricky one once you sort of dive into it, as is always the case with a lot of higher education stuff. I mean, if we want to get right down to the bones and the politics of it, and I think we can just about put aside the economics because unfortunately...
Well, I mean, that's not really the point of this podcast,
Yeah, we'll
Greg.
get to the economics, but the reality is that the government is doing this because there's a perception that this will help fix rent prices, essentially. Students coming in, we've got all these thousands of students coming in, they've got to live somewhere, they're taking up rent spaces that could have gone to true blue Australians, and as a result, this is doing action on somehow fixing rent prices. Really, that's what it comes down to. And it's contentious because, of course, it's in a sense blaming, really, international students for the rent crisis, which is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
But also, yes, they're bringing caps, and there's a bit of, as always happens with politics, both sides are kind of perhaps over-egging the case a bit. You know, you see unis are coming out and saying this is going to kill us, we're going to lose massive amounts. They probably will, but it might actually be due to this international students cap. This comes after a range of changes to migration, which actually made being a foreign student in Australia less attractive.
How did it do that?
Well, they kind of changed the path to going from being a student to getting permanent visas. They made that tougher. They increased the cost of doing it. So again, this came last year. Remember, we had all this talk about there's too much migration and we need to slow things down, and that was what was being done to help sort of counter those claims. The government put in all these measures, and actually they made studying here in Australia much less attractive because it costs more. The benefits of doing it aren't so good in terms of being able to get an actual Australian citizenship or at least a permanent residency. As a result, there have been some researchers into higher education who suggests that actually this international cap mightn't have a real impact because they mightn't even be able to reach that cap number because the demand or the numbers of students coming into Australia is already going to be low because we've made it harder to come here, we've made it less attractive, we've kind of reduced it. So it's a case of, unis are crying poor and saying this is going to kill them. And it might be a case that, yes, they are losing funding from international students, but it might actually be because of this international cap number. It might be the cumulative effect of all of those migration changes.
So have the numbers of students coming in dropped significantly over the previous years?
Well, what's happened was there was, of course, a big drop during 2020, 21, during the lockdowns. No one could get in Australia. Then there was a big surge back. Then it sort of steadied a bit. And now they're, in a sense, saying, let's go back to kind of what we were pre-pandemic. And, of course, some unis have got more than they they've actually increased the percentage or numbers of foreign students they've got. And so it's a bit hard to say either or, but essentially the government is, one, trying to get more money out of these international students through higher visa costs, but also kind of trying to reduce the numbers. And it seems to be working. And certainly universities are extremely worried because they are very reliant, some in particular, very reliant on international students for their funding.
And it wasn't always that way, was it? So how did universities come to be so reliant on international students for funding?
Well, I don't know if you've heard of a guy called John Howard.
It rings a bell.
No, look, basically, it really is a cumulative effect of over a couple of decades now, where one, government, certainly led by the Howard government, of cutting back government funding of the university sector, the higher education sector, and said, go and get funding from international students, because international students don't pay HECS.
Yeah.
They pay it up front.
Yeah.
And so governments can say, well, we're cutting back, but you've got the capacity to get these students from overseas, and because they're paying you money, you don't need our money. And it became kind of a bit of a vicious circle where universities were, in a sense, incentivized to do it. And as a result, government saying, oh, look, you've got all this money from foreign students. You don't need as much money from us, so we can cut it. And so then they're going, oh, well, we need more international students. And the government's able to say, oh, well, look, you guys are doing okay. And so it was that kind of a thing.
Yeah. And now the government's going, whoa.
Yeah.
Too many.
Yeah. It basically saying, can you cut back on those international students? Okay, what about the government funding? Oh, yeah, no.
No.
And so it certainly will have an impact. There are some universities that are highly dependent on foreign students, but it's not just universities, it's within certain disciplines within universities that are more dependent on foreign students than others.
So what kinds of disciplines are reliant on international students?
We certainly know that things like business, economics, those sort of managerial, sort of where you're going to less reliant, to put it bluntly, on the English language. I mean, I used to teach political communications and journalism at the University of Canberra, and we didn't have very, many foreign students. Each unit out of, say, 60 or 70, there might be a half dozen from China, or often had some from the Middle East as well. Because it's speaking an English language, it's not as attractive. Whereas doing a business course, something that's going to give you credentials, that is quite attractive. Certainly technical areas as well. So it's disciplines that are more reliant on that get really affected. Of course, you might also say, oh, well, that's okay. If you're in humanities, that's fine. But remember what's happened to the cost of humanities degrees under Scott Morrison's changes. They've gone up through the roof. So that's going to have an impact, or it's debatable just how much of an impact, but it certainly shows that there's struggles sort of either side. If you're doing okay in areas that are reliant on international students, you kind of probably missed out on a bit of the pain from the HECS increases. Now you're getting pain, and vice versa. So, but yeah, it's really a case of some universities are now projecting out, taking into account the drop in numbers that they're seeing due to the changes that happened last year, thinking what will happen with these cuts, the fact that overall there is this sense, especially in Asia, that Australians don't want them as much anymore, don't want these students. So they, well, I'll go to America, go to England. England and America will take them very happily.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be so bad if we hadn't had this decade of, in a sense, governments saying, use international students to fund you. And, now we're going to change. It's like, that's it's not a case of, the international students are just the cream that you can just, it adds a little bit of a boost to your funding. No, it's a core part of their funding now, and that's been a purposeful impact. And so whether it's actually going to have much of an impact on housing, which is, to be honest, why governments are doing, that's, I think, where we can have a bit of a debate.
Well, the ABS dropped some new figures today which look a little grim.
There's obviously more to the housing problem than population growth, and cutting immigration alone won't solve it.
When you look at who's borrowing the most and driving up prices, it's mostly owner-occupiers switching to a new home and investors who already own property.
For example, there's the lowest housing approvals in a decade. NIMBYism, the absence of social housing, tax breaks for investors, easy loans sold on commission, Airbnb robbing the long-term rental market. You've got to tackle them all.
Yeah, I mean, the housing market's pretty cooked at the moment. Maybe to put it lightly. You went into some new data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics this week in your column. Is it doing any better, Greg?
No, it's not, Elinor.
Oh,
it's not doing any better. Well, it's doing better if you own a home.
Okay. Well, then that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. No, look, and just to not leave the international students behind, yes, it might have a marginal impact on rents, but rent prices have been going up all around the country in places where there are a number of international students boosting demand, where there aren't many international students boosting demand. And remember, we're just lowering the numbers of international students. We're not cutting them to zero like happened during the lockdowns. This is a very marginal impact, and as a result, it's going to have a very marginal impact on rent. The impact is going to be much greater on universities than it actually will be in the rental sector. But yeah, the housing market, we had the latest housing price figures come out from the Bureau of Stats this week. Look, let's sugarcoat the numbers a bit.
Okay.
If you're in Sydney, the median price of a house in Sydney hasn't gone up from 3 months ago. It's still 1.4 million. 1.4 million is the median house price in Sydney. And overall, throughout Australia, if you look at the average dwelling price, which takes into account houses, apartments, all dwellings across all of Australia, the average cost of a dwelling in Australia at the moment is around $973,000. Great. Now, that sounds bad.
It does sound bad, yes.
But believe me, it'll sound worse once I've gone through what that means. Now, the best way to really look at housing affordability and whether house prices are getting harder and harder to afford is to compare it with household incomes, average household income. And last week when the GDP figures come out, one of the great things in there, they actually have figures on household income.
Oh,
you can divide that by the population and get household income per person, so basically an average. Now, back in 2000, the average cost of a dwelling in Australia was about equivalent to 9 years of the average household annual income.
Yeah.
So it was a house cost 9 years of your income. Now it's 16.8.
So over how many years?
Yeah, so in 25 years, it's gone from 9 to 16.8. And I know you think, oh, well, God, it's always been going up like that. No. From 1970 to 2000, so over that 30 years, it went from about 7.5 to 9. So barely, and kind of there 2%. Were periods in the 70s where it was up around sort of 8.5, 9, bumped up and down.
Yeah, and then almost doubled in 25 years.
Yeah, so it kind of was. We had pretty much a generation, and you think of the generations who got into housing between 1970 and 2000, mainly baby boomers who were sort of, turning 30s in 1980s. The Generation X people like me who were able to get in the housing market in the late 1990s. We were kind of used to, housing's always expensive. Yeah, it's about 7, 8, 9 times my annual income. That's expensive. Yeah. But it hadn't really changed.
Yeah.
And people would say, I can remember when a house was $200,000 and that was really expensive. It's like, yeah, but that was back when we were earning, $30,000 a year was a good income, And so house prices were going up in line with household income, like they should.
Yeah.
But since then, no, they're going completely opposite directions. Now you're not thinking 8 or 9 years, you're thinking 16.
Yeah.
It'll be 17
now I'm thinking,
very soon.
Like I save up for a house and the amount that I save up is just getting completely outstripped by an increase in house prices.
Put it this way, think of the standard thing for a deposit, 20%.
Yeah.
So what's 20% of 9 years? compared to what's 20% of 17 years.
Yeah.
And how long, because you can't save your entire income either.
No.
How long you need to be able to save to get a deposit to buy. The change is an order of magnitude different. It's gone from being, wow, to use Joe Hockey's words, I'm going to have to get a good job.
Yeah.
And I've got a good job. Now we're going to have to save, and we're going to have to really tighten our belts a bit, but we can do it. If we can do it, especially if you got a partner who has a job as well. You think, okay, we can at least get into a foothold, buy an apartment, buy a townhouse, buy something. Now it's like, oh, well, I've got a good job. So's my partner. Oh, 17 years.
Yeah, we've been saving.
And that's the absurdity about it all. And
now it's bank of mum and dad.
Yeah, and to suggest that, the way we're going to need to fix that is we've got to have fewer people renting so that there can be more people buying. I know we'll put a little cap on international students. That'll help.
Bit of a Band-Aid solution.
It's not even a Band-Aid. I mean, geez, it's pretty much your mum sort of just licking your scar and going, yeah, the ouchie's all better now. So, it's nothing. I mean, and it's the worst thing about it is it's all part of this sense of, oh, look at us, we're acting on something. It's like, are you really? And I've said this before, and I wrote it in the article again. What was the big change? Well, in September 1990, John Howard and Peter Costello changed capital gains tax and introduced a 50% discount on capital gains tax, and that set fire to housing investment, made negative gearing great. And there's plenty of economists out there, especially conservative ones, who go, oh no, if you do the formula and look at the independent variables and all that, the actual impact of this is not all that great, and there's other factors at play. I'm like, okay, maybe it is just coincidence, a really amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
But let's just say it isn't a coincidence. It still has not helped things, because we know it has affected investing. It's made negative gearing more attractive, and all the benefits go into the richest. 80% of the benefit of that capital gains tax discount goes to the richest 10%. 41% of all capital gains in Australia are earned by people whose total income is more than $1 million.
Wow.
40%. 41%. So, because to be honest, the very rich people, as they say, the rich are not like you and me. They don't earn their money through salary and wages. They earn it through investments, through capital gains, and they're getting a 50% discount on those capital gains. You're not getting a 50% discount on your income, saying,
I'm not getting anything.
They're not saying, you don't get a tax discount on the first 50% of your income earned. You get a tax discount on the first $18,200 you earn. So, if you earned $100,000, great, you got a tax-free discount of 18.2%, not 50% like if you're in capital gains. But, oh God, we've got to protect these poor, let's be honest, millionaires.
Making their unproductive income.
Yeah. So my argument is, okay, we know that getting rid of the discount, okay, I'm not saying it's going to cure housing affordability. It's not going to make it worse, though.
It'd probably do a whole lot more than putting a cap on international students.
And here's the other thing, the cost. The cost of that capital gains discount, like if we just said you have to pay tax like it's income tax. The cost in the last financial year, the Treasury estimated was around $19 billion.
For capital gains discount?
Yeah, that was the cost in foregone revenue. If they didn't have that discount, the government would have raised an extra $19 billion. And remember, because 80% of that going to the richest, so that means around $15.5 billion went to the richest 10% in Australia.
In one financial year.
In one financial year.
God.
Now, then let's think about the other thing, the HAF, the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is $10 billion. That is basically seed funding for people to make investments and get a return on, which the government will then use the returns on that investment to build affordable housing. It's like, why not just tax these people properly? You could get $15 billion from the richest 10% and use that to, I don't know, build houses.
Yeah, just spend it now.
Spend it now.
Yeah.
Build houses. So it really is a case of just highlighting how we see this a lot. We see this from the opposition when they talk about how we're going to solve housing. Oh, well, super. It's like, no, superannuation is about retirement incomes. Let's not solve the housing crisis by dealing with retirement incomes policy or dealing with migration policy or higher education policy. Let's try and fix housing by actually trying to fix housing, rather than using all these rinky-dink kind of things, which, might convince someone that, oh, we're not getting any more of those foreign students. Well, we're still getting them and we're not going to get just slightly as many, but, is that really going to affect anything? No. Just the same as we hear all this talk about, oh, we're going to ban foreigners from buying houses. It's not, the issue. The issue is we need more supply, and our tax system is geared towards incentivizing investors to buy more houses rather than assisting people to buy their first house.
All right, that's probably about all we've got time for today, Greg. Thanks so much.
No worries, Elinor. Always wonderful to talk such happy things about home ownership for all our younger listeners especially. If you'd like to read more about housing affordability, go to my column, Grogonomics, on the Guardian Australia website. And for more information on any range of policies, please go to our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. My Twitter handle and the handle I use are all social media is @GrogsGamma, and Elinor's is
@ElinorJ_L.
If you'd like to leave any feedback or ask some questions that we can answer in future episodes, please email us at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or just shout out to us at our Twitter handle @TheOzInstitute, and that's AUS Institute. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
See ya.